for most of session, and then when the House passed out the Pastor Protection Act, we sent it over to the Senate, and the Senate amended the Pastor Protection Act to include that Senate Bill 284, putting FOTA inside the Pastor Protection Act. And there's been a lot of controversy around it. It's actually consumed the headlines for the past 10 days. But most recently, the governor made a pretty clear statement that he will not sign or allow any of these bills to go through with such language that exists inside of the current version of 757, which is good. We've been openly opposed to this bill, the FOTA bill specifically, since the inception of it, and it was very nice to see the governor come out and be outspoken against it. So I don't see that bill getting too much traction anymore this session.
One of my main efforts for this legislative session has been to pass legislation to address the issue of untested rape kits. We know that this is an issue here in Georgia. It's also been an issue nationally, and I was very proud to pass this legislation in the House unanimously, 160 to nothing. It has the support of law enforcement, victims' rights groups, as well as care providers. It is now in the Senate, and we have to work very, very hard to get it passed through the Senate, but that's part of the legislative process. It is not an easy process, and that's by design. But I'm hopeful that we can get that passed and then signed by the governor this year.
The next big bill that's got a lot of attention pre-session and then in the beginning of session was the medical marijuana bill, HB 722. Most recently, that bill had a committee hearing, and they stripped most of the language in there that was calling for the cultivation of medical marijuana in Georgia. And so that bill doesn't have that language anymore in it, but nevertheless it expands on the current medical cannabis law that currently does exist in the state. We also expanded the ailments and diseases that will be covered for these patients to have access to the cannabinoid oils. It's not a perfect bill. It's not what we intended for it to be when we started out this session, but nevertheless it's a step in the right direction for bringing access to medical care that was otherwise unavailable. Another big component of this bill is that it includes language to prohibit criminal liability for manufacturers who end up shipping the oil into Georgia, because right now it is illegal to do that. And so this bill was intended to help curb those criminal liabilities in the event that manufacturers do bring the oil to the state of Georgia.
Campus carry has been a hot topic this session as well. It was brought up previously but did not pass because the chancellor, the board of regents, and every president of every university in this state does not want it. Professors don't want it. There are some students who are supportive, but many students who are not. So House Bill 859 is the vehicle that's being used this year to push campus carry, and it passed the House and is currently in the Senate. I opposed it after listening to the district that I represent, which includes a number of professors, and I even gave a floor speech and noted a couple of things. One is that Justice Scalia, who of course was one of the most conservative members of the United States Supreme Court, in one of his opinions, DC versus Heller, wrote very clearly that the Second Amendment is not unlimited and that the court has always approved restrictions of place, and those include schools. And so he said there's a long history here. And then I also talked about, as did one of my colleagues, 1824 meeting minutes of the University of Virginia, the Board of Advisors for the University of Virginia. There were two of our founding fathers present at that meeting. One was President Jefferson, the other was President Madison. And at that meeting, they considered guns on the University of Virginia campus, and they were not allowed. And so for those who like to go to an originalist interpretation to try to discern what the founding fathers meant, we don't have to look very far because we know exactly how they interpreted it, and so there is room for disagreement on this topic. And so it is currently in the Senate, and they are getting a lot of pushback. One other part of this discussion, which I very vocally and publicly criticized, was that the public was not given any advance notice that the bill was going to be heard in the House, none. It was just called up, and I didn't think that that was right. And in the Senate, the public was giving an advance notice, and so they had testimony from the Chancellor and others who were able to have an opportunity to talk about their positions. And interestingly, the bill was not immediately passed, as they are listening and doing what they're supposed to do, of listening to the community and the experts before making a vote. So it's unclear as to what will ultimately happen, but odds are it will pass, and in part that's because both the governor and the lieutenant governor had said that they would be supportive of passage. If you take a step back, some cynics might say, well, this is an election year, and the governor came out very forcefully against the religious freedom bills, and so he needs to give some legislative victories to what they call their base of supporters, and so that's why we may see the campus carry bill actually move forward this year. But we will see how that plays out.
The next agenda item is electronic discovery. It's not necessarily something that a lot of people come in touch with in their day-to-day routine, but it was a very complicated bill that was going to essentially create a different e-discovery system in our court systems. And there was a lot of attention given to it in the Judiciary Committee on the House side. We actually ended up moving that bill out of the House, but it actually died during crossover day. We didn't even bring it up during crossover day, so there won't be any legs on that legislation for this year. But I would expect us next year to potentially see, kind of reviving that bill up and figuring out a way to deal with the e-discovery issues that we do face in our legal system.
Up next is fireworks. Last year, the General Assembly passed a bill, and you all are probably familiar with it. It effectively took the restrictions off of fireworks, so they could be fired up until, I think, midnight any day, and until 2 a.m. on July 4th and on New Year's Eve. So I have received a lot of negative feedback about this, which I voted against when it came through the first time. Fortunately, there is a fix that will allow local governments to correct it and to reduce the hours to a more reasonable 10 p.m. And so hopefully that will get passed, and then the various cities within our community, Chamblee, Brookhaven, Dorval, etc., will then pass ordinances to restrict it. Because right now, state law outweighs the local efforts on this, and so there was really nothing that the police could do. The police were getting a lot of phone calls, but there was nothing that they could do because the state law made it at a ridiculous hour, and so we're working to get that corrected.
Another big agenda item that was a lot of attention given to, mainly on the Senate side this session, was the MARTA expansion bill. That bill, unfortunately, did not go anywhere in the Senate, and it effectively died this session. This bill was going to bring the ability to have a 1% tax go to referendum for the 3 counties that have MARTA, and the intent behind this was to expand the rail system. MARTA's proposed about an $8 billion expansion to include rail lines that go kind of across the northern arc of 285 up 400, a Lindbergh, Emory, CDC corridor rail that goes all the way out towards Decatur and Indian Creek Way. And there was a really concerted effort to bring that to life, but unfortunately that legislation on the Senate side failed just a few days ago. However, just recently over the past couple of days, the proponents of transit expansion, everybody's kind of put their brains together, and we've come up with a potential solution through a local legislation avenue to bring the ability for voters to get back to the polls to vote on this 1% or 1 penny tax. And I have not seen any legislation yet, but it's being discussed at this moment because we don't have a lot of time left. But there is a potential that this legislation goes through the local delegations and end up actually having effect in the 3 counties or the cities, specifically Atlanta, this session. So we'll obviously bring any updates on that, but that will certainly consume a lot of headlines if it does come to light here in the next couple of days.
Is it just a matter of people just can't stand another tax? Is that, anybody who sits in traffic around here is just insane not to do this stuff.
It certainly is a different mindset. What's frustrating is that
I know.
areas of Georgia who don't have MARTA truly understand the need for the expansion, and so you run into a lot of ancillary arguments that really prevent and create obstacles for doing what we desperately need here in the metro city region, or the metro region. And so that's one of the biggest struggles that we have, is trying just to get a lot of the, I guess, the outlying parts of the state to understand that this is really necessary, for the infrastructure of the state as a whole. Right now we don't have funding from the state that goes to transit, so we have to come up with ways, like this one penny tax, to create a revenue stream to build these transit lines. Otherwise, there are no revenue sources or funding sources to build and expand the transit system.
So there's nothing they're interested in that can't, I lived in Columbus, Georgia for 30 years. So I get that, hey, that's Atlanta, and we don't care. But people from Columbus, people from Savannah, people from Augusta, they come to Atlanta. And with a viable rail system, you could park your car, I don't know, maybe make a parking tax in Atlanta, or charge. That's what they did in London. You have to pay big time money to park your car within the city limits. And I'm not all for taxes, I'm really not, but it's just the traffic here just begs for something. I'm amazed at I think MARTA, whoever the new guy is that's over MARTA, is doing a great job and trying to make it more viable for people. But yeah, until you put it up 400, you're not going to have the ridership that needs to be riding it to really appreciate it.
Certainly, and that's why the people who really are invested in bringing MARTA expansion, everyone's working together in these very few hours that we have left in the session to figure out a solution to get this ball rolling. Otherwise, we're going to waste another year sitting around without anything in motion, sitting around in traffic without a solution. So we are really working hard as local delegations to figure this problem out.
It's a fact that you cannot build your way out of a traffic problem by building more roads. If that worked, then China wouldn't have traffic.
Exactly.
And of course they do. And so we absolutely need transit. And I think there's slowly becoming a greater recognition around the state that 78% roughly of the state's GDP is the metro Atlanta area. And so if we want to continue to be competitive and to grow, this is one of the things that we need to do. Name a world-class city, a world-class economic city that doesn't have a functioning transit infrastructure. You can't. And so it's very, very important. And candidly, part of the challenge that we had this year was not only making this relevant for those outside, but it was a key metro area legislator who was not supportive, and that's Senator John Albers. And so there needs to continue to be an education effort, and really citizens need to be very vocal about their desire for this and their displeasure with sitting in traffic an hour or more each way to and from work and other places where people want to go. It's just, it's not working, and it's something that we really need to
Even from an
commit to.
ecological standpoint, I mean, just
Right.
the crap going in the air
Yeah.
from all these cars sitting there.
And efficiency, if one cares about efficiency and studies efficiency, a car is not an efficient mode of transportation. Cars are wonderful, and I love my car, but it's not an efficient mode of transportation. There are much more efficient ways of getting people around, and we need to start thinking seriously about those. Casinos and gambling, it's dead for the year. It did not come up for a vote. We had it on our rules calendar, which the rules calendar is the calendar of bills that we can vote on the floor of either the House or the Senate any day. Bills have to go through their respective committees and then through the Rules Committee. And it was on what's called the rules calendar for us to be able to vote, but then it did not come up for a floor vote because many members received a lot of negative pushback in their communities, and so they didn't want to move forward with it. It would require a constitutional amendment, which means that in the House they'd need 120 votes, and I think in part they weren't sure if they were able to get the votes, and in part they also just weren't committed to the policy choice of having gambling. And one of the real issues was It's not always about the money, but money is usually part of each and every conversation about policy. And there was a disagreement between the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus in terms of ensuring that dollars would be used for needs-based scholarships, because it is a fact that many students in our state do not return to school because $50 per credit hour keeps them from going to get education. And it is a fact that we know that we are dealing with a skills gap. And so we need to make it easier for people to acquire the education they need, whether technical, associate's degree, et cetera. And we were committed to making sure that the dollars would be used to help the people that really need those dollars to continue their education. And that commitment wasn't provided. And so we'll see if the conversation continues. I know that the casinos spent a massive amount of money on dinners and nice things for legislators. I didn't take any. Representative Bennett didn't take any. That's not what we do. But plenty of legislators were treated incredibly well to try to influence their votes. And so that's a to be continued of what happens going forward. And I'll just tell you, even taking all those aside, I wasn't convinced about the economic argument that it would really, in the end, be something that would be an overall positive for Georgia. I know that gambling can generate a lot of tax revenue, but the house always wins, right? And so ultimately that's who's going to get very, very wealthy. And gambling brings other challenges and issues which are pretty bad. You have people who make poor decisions in terms of gambling, and then they wind up losing, getting into financial straits. There's also a correlation between gambling and prostitution and sex trafficking and other things. And so it's not just this rosy story about we have a nice shiny casino and everything gets better. There's a lot of negatives that come with it. So I wasn't sold that we wanted to go in that direction in terms of our future economic development. There's only one Vegas, and there's a reason for that. And I think a lot of people who like to gamble would probably still prefer to go to Las Vegas and not necessarily to go where Turner Field used to be. And that's another thing that's just nuts if you think about it. We have, within the metro region, we have Cobb County taking away from Fulton County. And that type of economic growth, it's not. It's just absolutely ridiculous where we have this system to where within our own area we're fighting each other for stadiums and assets. We should be working together to grow the health of the overall economy instead of having Cobb take away a stadium which was perfectly fine from downtown Atlanta. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
You were talking about veterans bills?
Or you can.
Yeah, no, it's fine. One of the big agenda items that the Democratic caucus had this year was a package of veterans bills to help facilitate better quality of life for our veterans and their families. We got news last year that there was the BRAC Commission was looking for some base realignment and mission realignments here in Georgia that would affect thousands and thousands of troops and their families that were stationed here. And so what we did as a caucus was really generate a legislative agenda that was going to help facilitate various aspects of everyday life to make it easier on military families. And we've seen some pretty good success with that so far. One of the bills that we were able to pass was Representative Al Williams was able to get through a piece of legislation that was going to allow professional licenses, certain professional licenses holders that come to the state of Georgia to work to really kind of have priority in getting those licenses honored here. So if you come over from Texas, for example, and you got a cosmetology license, you would basically get to jump to the front of the line here and ensure that your license was honored here and that you could get right to work. That way we wouldn't have spouses waiting 6 months to work in their respective professions. Another bill that we have is HB 862, allows disabled veterans with honorable discharge to qualify for homestead exemption. Any veteran able to get statutory reward qualifies for the exemption, and it makes it easier just to obtain the exemption. And so this again goes back to the quality of life that we're trying to improve improve here in Georgia, so we don't lose bases and we don't lose the military presence that we have here. We have hundreds of thousands of military family and personnel here, and our mission was to create a better quality of life so we can continue leading the country with military presence here.
Chamblee update. I know that it's been a big issue, and I think everybody knows that it's not going to happen, and that's in terms of the potential annexation for La Vista Hills. The city ultimately decided that they weren't going to pursue it this year, and so I don't know what that means in terms of the future. It'll all depend on if there are other annexations and things like that that might take place with the commercial property. In a conversation that I had with legislative counsel about the possibility of doing an annexation freeze, the response was that that would need to be a general bill, and there's no way that you could do an annexation freeze for the entire state, because other areas of the state would want to have some progress in terms of what they're working on. So that does not appear to be viable, and so we'll just see if anything happens with that next year. The timing of the effort wasn't ideal, and I know that that's in part because the referendum for La Vista Hills was just last November, but I wasn't contacted until I think day 13 of the legislative session, and then it didn't really get known to the public until around that same time, and the public had deserved to have an opportunity to have their viewpoints heard and to learn what it might cost and what it might look like in terms of the restructuring, but that is not going to move forward, and so again we'll see what might transpire moving forward, but it's not going to happen this year.
One thing I do want to mention I forgot is it was actually it was a great bill that we were able to get passed just last week. Representative Keisha Waits led the charge on House Bill 54, which provides full college tuition to kids of public service officers that are killed in the line of duty. And the funding is being provided by voluntary donations, state income tax, and driver's license revenues. And that was something that it was a wonderful piece of legislation that really closes the gap in our state in situations, very unfortunate situations that do happen. We're very proud to have that go through.
All right. And
on the notion of annexation, is there any appetite for, among the legislative efforts to rationalize annexation law, to make sure that everyone on both sides of an annexation gets a vote?
that I don't know if it's possible or not, but there are efforts to standardize the process so it's not so ad hoc as it's been over the last few years. The issue about allowing some but not all to vote is a difficult one, and you have to draw the line at some place, and I'm not exactly sure why it's always just been those within the proposed area, not those that are affected by the vote, but that's been the policy, and I'm certainly open to ideas and suggestions, and I know a lot of hard work has been put into it, and I would be supportive of having a clear process laid out. And it didn't make it into any of the bills this year, but I also think that having a petition requirement makes a lot of sense. Of go to the community, talk to the community, and see if they want it. One of the challenges that I've had in all of these iterations of incorporation and annexation is to get a real sense of where people are, because you have some people who are quite vocal, you have many people who aren't tuned in at all, and then you have other people who are opposed, and to get a sense of, well, what percentage of the overall populace is this, it's near impossible to tell. And so having some better data in which you could be informed about that is really helpful. We tried really hard to catalog emails and phone calls and communications, but that's imperfect. but we tried to do that to get some sense, to give me some measure of where people stand. But it is difficult because some of those are, I won't use the term self-selected, but in some ways they kind of are. Of certain groups will write to people and say, please write, and here's the template message, and then that kind of gets forwarded on. So all that said is, I think that we definitely need a better process, but I do understand why people were really interested in trying to move on Chamblee this year, and why I was open-minded to listen to it, which I always am, and I think that's my job to be, not to be closed-minded, but open-minded, and to listen and to try to make the best judgments. There is a real concern that any possibility of incorporation could be foreclosed. And granted, people could say, well, it was foreclosed when the vote failed last November, and that's a fair statement. But perhaps there could be a way to look at a smaller, less ambitious proposal that may be viable. And the commercial properties, I know, are under the watchful and interested eyes of the interested cities, who may be very happy to take in the commercial properties and leave the rest of the areas unsettled. But as a bigger question for DeKalb, this conversation is not going away. As much as we might want it to, it's not going away, and it exists in South DeKalb too. They have a couple of efforts there, Stonecrest and Greenhaven, and there may be others where people are really interested in having a vote. And I supported the referendum for Chamblee's annexation, for Tucker, for La Vista Hills, and so certainly I want to be supportive of other areas of DeKalb, and not just say, okay, it's fine for people in North DeKalb to have these opportunities, but not for people in South DeKalb. But it's I don't have the answers, but it is something that I'm committed to continue to work on, and I absolutely agree with the position that the system that we have, regardless of what side you're on, is broken and isn't working as efficiently or effectively.
Sometimes I get the feeling like everybody wants to break off because they think if I can have it local, then I can see better what's done with my money, and it's going to be used where I am.
Right.
And so is DeKalb too big? I mean, what's the real issue? And I think people just want to break off. And, I was kind of like, I'm for it. I don't care. I mean, it's kind of like, hey, we don't know what's going to really happen. So if I'm going to get charged the same property tax or more property tax if I break off, then, especially more, then no, I don't want to. It all really, I don't know, I could be wrong about other people, but for me, it's really a matter of I pay a lot of property taxes, and I want them to be used near where I live, or at least equitably with the rest of the county. Is DeKalb County too big? I don't know. But sometimes I think people start going for some kind of solution before there's any thought about what's the real issue here. Is it just that we've been really poorly taxed and not equitably things done across the county rather than in certain sections and, too much cronyism or whatever? What's the real issue?
Right. Well, my response would be that a structural change in and of itself does not fix and cure all the issues. You have to have good people involved. For Brookhaven's incorporation, we have to give a lot of credit to this man right here because of the Brookhaven Post, because without him, there would have been not as much oversight and transparency in terms of the workings of the cities. And so with respect to DeKalb, they get well covered with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but for some of the smaller cities, do they have the same level of scrutiny as Brookhaven gets in other areas, as DeKalb County gets, City of Atlanta gets? I don't know, and the public deserves that, but that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort in order to bring those ideas or to bring those issues to the forefront. But I'll add just a couple other quick things, and then we can open up for questions as well. It may surprise some of you to hear what I just said in light of the fact that I am one of the authors of a CEO change proposal. But I will readily admit that just changing the structure does not equal everything works perfectly. I, however, believe that you can make some structural changes that can reduce the likelihood of problems and issues. By way of example, if you use the case of Burl Ellis, the proposal that I put forward would take some of those responsibilities that he had and put them into a professional county manager who is approved by the board and then supervised by the chair. I would move to a chair model with a professional county manager. Professional county manager would not be involved in politics. Professional county manager's job would only be to oversee the administration of the county. What does that mean? That means that that person would not have to put pressure on contractors for re-election. And so there are structural things that you can do to address some of the challenges that we've had. There are more differences within the proposal, but you have to get good people involved. That's certainly key. You have to have oversight, 100%. You have to have transparency. I think DeKalb has made some good progress towards transparency, and within the proposal that I put forward, which is House Bill 1099, it would have all contracts which are approved by the board, which are those at $12,500 and above, those require board approval. It would require those to all be put online. And so we would, as citizens, be able to easily go and see, okay, these are the things that they're spending money on. Do those make sense? And if they don't make sense, then we can criticize them and hold people accountable. So the bill, as it stands, it made it out of the DeKalb House Delegation Policy Committee today, and so that means I can go and get signatures and try to move the bill forward. Honestly, I don't know if it's going to pass or not. I've been to South DeKalb. I held a town hall meeting there with representatives who represent that area, and there was definitely some pushback in South DeKalb. I'm going to another meeting on Thursday in South DeKalb that's being hosted by the NAACP, and I'm going to continue to talk to people about it and see if they're open to moving it to a referendum. But the views are not monolithic on this, and interestingly, if you go to South DeKalb, you will hear a lot of criticism that North DeKalb gets everything, and that we have all the shiny new things, and the money is not being spent equitably. But then you will regularly hear in this area, no, South DeKalb gets everything. So there are definitely issues of perception in terms of equity and how money is being spent. But what propels me, and one of the reasons why I thought it was appropriate to try to have this conversation this year, is that it's a presidential election year. We have the highest turnout in presidential election years, and a decision this big, I think, should have the greatest amount of participation. Typically, when government wants to make changes, it sets itself up for success. It asks the question in a way that really only prompts a yes answer, like, do you like ice cream and puppy dogs? Yes. So I wanted it to be a much more inclusive process than that, and not have it on an off-year cycle where we have like 5, 6, 7% people turn out. In presidential election years, DeKalb always has over 50% turnout. And so I thought that was appropriate. And coupled with that, the decision, should it be passed by the General Assembly, will rest in the hands of all of DeKalb's citizens. And so it would then force a conversation across the county about what are the differences between our existing model, what is the new proposal, and then do you want to change or do you want to stick with what you have? But it would be an option that the citizens of DeKalb would get to make. It would not be something, and cannot be something, that is chosen just by the legislators. It has to go to the voters to make that call and the decision. And I know, and Representative Bennett knows, that there's a lot of interest in having a proposed change to a different model because people are not satisfied with it. And candidly, some of the pushes towards incorporation, either wholly or partially, were motivated by a lack of approval with how the county has been running. So, anything you want to add?
No, that was the next thing, was the CEO bill, so.
Okay. So, with that, we can open it up to questions if y'all have any.
If anybody has any good ones.
This has nothing to do with anything other than what y'all might have done today. Are either one of you on shooting on civil?
No.
Do you know if SD 304 made it out of shooting on civil? That was Elena's post-incarceration gun purchase bill.
No idea.
Don't know.
I'm not sure. We can check real quick.
I just didn't check for it.
I've got a master list in here of all the bills that came over, hundreds of them. We can check.
What number was it?
304,
304.
SB 304,
Speaking of guns, before I
won't
hand
show
it
up
back, we
till
talked about the
campus carry.
campus area.
So
So
just-
both of y'all are what, were you voting on it?
I not only voted against it, I spoke against it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And an update on that, it did come out of committee today in the Senate. So it's going to the Senate floor, or Senate room. It'll go, for all intents and purposes, it's gonna pass the Senate. And it'll go to the governor.
You think there's no hope that it won't, there's no hope that they can't change it in any way in the Senate, so it's erased?
Not after the governor and lieutenant governor publicly said they're gonna sign it.
So this is sort of a naive comment, but has anyone ever suggested that they allow guns on the House and Senate
Yeah,
floor?
I've heard that.
Many times.
suggestion.
So it has been officially suggested?
Oh, I criticized us for not doing that in my floor speech a few years ago.
Oh,
And
thank
it
you.
made people pretty mad.
Really?
Yeah.
So that one won't go through? Has the governor taken a stand on that?
No, it won't go through, so.
Which seems a little odd.
Yeah.
A little
Seems a little
inconsistent.
hypocritical.
Yeah, well,
Not that I want to put you in danger, but
no, but there is a distinction, and that distinction is this. The Capitol has security, and so one doesn't need a firearm in the Capitol because it is a secure zone. You know that there is nobody who can harm you within the Capitol because nobody is carrying weapons. And so for college campuses, they don't have that security, and the mindset of those who are supportive is that they aren't carrying it with any ill intent or desire to harm anybody. It's just to have for the purposes of self-defense. So without having the campus be secured in terms of guards and metal detectors, that's the sort of distinction. But within the Capitol, we know that everybody is disarmed, and so you wouldn't come across somebody who might hold you up with a firearm because it just factually can't happen. But
Sure.
granted, there is some hypocrisy. Yeah.
Everybody's.
Certainly makes me glad my daughter's out of school.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's no professors that want it.
Is
You know, didn't
overwhelming.
that say something to them at all, the fact that none of the professors want it? If anybody should be concerned, it's that professor.
It's not only the professor, every school, every public university in the region system wrote letters against it. There's not a single region school that was supportive of this. And if I'm not mistaken, I stand corrected, but I don't think any other state that has campus carry doesn't have the opt-in, opt-out clause. So we'll be the first state of the 7 that has campus carry that won't have the opt-in, opt-out. And so it creates really a mandatory bar on prohibiting schools from making their own security measures, which, you know, I think that would be a middle ground is having the opt-in, opt-out language, but we don't have that.
But only public schools. So
So
private
private
schools can continue, and that was one of the points I made in my speech too. For those of you who believe that the private sector comes up with better solutions than the public sector, the private sector is still going to continue to not allow weapons on campuses. So,
And to further expound on that point is that if I also stand corrected, but I don't think a single private school in the state of Texas who recently just passed this has elected to allow guns on their campus. So all private institutions in the state of Texas are still standing by, you know, their belief that this is not a good thing and they don't want to be a part of it. And then on top of that, I believe that the state of Texas had to appropriate 27 or 47 or something $1 million to the University of Texas for security measures to be put in place because of this. So there was And even, there was an awareness that there was
There
gonna
was
be
a greater
increased,
cost.
there was gonna be need for security, more security for it.
Because most college campuses do have campus security. You can't have one door like they do at the Capitol, but
So I will continue to be outspoken against this because I think it's it's a bad piece of legislation.
To add an absurd question to an absurd concept, will the General Assembly be in charge for writing the specs for the outside dorm gun lockers?
oh yeah.
They're not gonna be allowed in the dorms, and so they would probably be in vehicles if students even bring
But I
them.
guess it's 21 and over, so I guess
Right.
most 21-year-olds don't live in dorms anyway.
Maybe.
The other thing too that also really gets me is that one of the prohibitions in the bill, however, doesn't allow weapons inside athletic events, but that doesn't prohibit weapons from being present at tailgating for the athletic
Ay,
events.
ay, ay.
And so you're mixing situations that are absolutely,
Volatile.
yeah, highly volatile situations. And there's no middle ground for that. And the points that were brought up, in the 4 speeches by Scott and some other reps was, in the event that the whole purpose is the concept was to have defense, okay, in the event that someone has a gun. But if you can't go in your dorm, or you can't take it in somewhere else, you have to leave it in your car, you're defenseless as it is. So the logic to me doesn't really make sense. So again, I get back to it's just a bad bill.
Right. And the proponents of allowing guns in churches and bars repeatedly said, which we passed last year,
What could go
repeatedly
wrong?
said, or 2 years ago, that you have to respect and recognize private property rights. And so basically what we have in the United States today is this
But it's a state school. Wait a minute, okay, I'm sorry.
two different things.
Okay.
But here's the point that I'm making. There are some who believe incorrectly that the law of the land is that you can carry anywhere at any time. That is factually untrue. One can prevent somebody from bringing a firearm into one's home because you have private property rights, and so that would mean that if I'm a licensed gun holder and I wanted to come visit you and you said, no, you're not allowed to bring it into my home, I could either leave and not go into your home, or I could go put it in my car and then come into your home. But if you go to the airport, if you go to sporting events, if you go to all these various places, which all of us know, weapons are not allowed, there are times where people do not have the right under our law to carry in self-defense at all times. And so we don't have this perfect patchwork of consistency and logic as we approach this. And even in this bill, as Representative Bennett just said, the bill itself has exceptions. So they're not allowed in dormitories, they're not allowed in fraternities, they're not allowed in sororities, and they're not allowed at athletic facilities. So that too says that at certain places, we're going to, as society, accept the risk that you could be at risk by not having your firearm for self-defense, because we think overall that is safer because of the factors that take place at those places. So it's not an easy issue, and I think one of the challenges that we have in talking about guns is that we don't talk about it. People tend to get emotional on both sides of this discussion, and there's not a lot of understanding where each side is coming from, or a recognition that both sides have valid arguments. So it's unfortunate because it is an important conversation, and I think that people care very, very deeply, and ultimately everybody wants the same thing, which is fewer lives to be lost. We just have different views in terms of what's the best way to get that.
And forgive me, because this is my ignorance, but how big a gun can you take into a classroom? Can you take any gun into a classroom? Can you take an
Yes.
AK-47 into a classroom?
Those were examples that were given, yes. You could be sitting in sociology class and someone could walk in with a fully automatic AR-15 assault
And this
rifle.
isn't supposed to give anybody any qualms?
Now granted, the requirement is that it be concealed,
Right.
but
Well, the requirement is that it be
as we know,
so it'd be
these,
hard to-
you know, these weapons can be altered and you can make a concealed
Okay.
case
Okay,
with
that was
certain
my
weapons,
ignorance.
but, yeah, it has to be concealed under the legislation, but somewhere the code conceals it, it's concealed.
How about outlawing coats in classrooms? Sorry.
Well, it will be interesting to see the fallout, and to go back to the Texas example, some high-profile educators have resigned over it, and so if, I don't know if that will happen or not, but clearly people are really unhappy about it, and that goes to the point that I made in terms of there being no opportunity for public comment in the House, and granted, maybe it would have just been ignored, but people have the right to be heard, and especially people who are directly impacted by this legislation. We really should listen to those folks. And one of the things that I've said many, many times is the Chancellor, he and I were both freshman members in 2011, and he was a Republican member of the House. Hank Huckabee is not soft on the Second Amendment, but he absolutely believes that the right policy call is to keep our current law in place. And that's another thing, is our current law is 100% constitutional. 100%. If there were a constitutional challenge, it would fail. And it's not a question. Justice Scalia has explicitly written on this. It would 100% fail that weapons can be restricted. It's just a fact. And so Chancellor Huckabee, former Republican member of the House, Larry Ellis, a member of the Board of Regents, he was a 4-star general back when I was in the Army at Fort McPherson. He opposes this. Dan Kaufman, who until recently was the first president of Georgia Gwinnett College, he was the person who started the school. He is a retired general officer. He was commandant at the United States Military Academy. These are people who have a lot of facility with weapons, a lot of knowledge with weapons, and whose opinions I really value and respect, and all of them were absolutely opposed to it. And the public is 78%, across party lines, 78% for the state of Georgia, a poll that was done by the AJC, opposed. So elections matter. Anything else?
Are you ready to play our instruments?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.